Мне просили
Hello.
напомнить про чат-бота и QR-код, куда вы
I've been
можете
told to
отправлять
remind you of
ваши
the QR
вопросы.
code and the
И
chatbot.
я
You
начну
know what to do about
рассказывать
them.
про архитектуру безопасности
So
будущего.
I'm here to
Меня
tell you
зовут
about
Лучник Анна.
InfoSec architecture of the
Почему
future.
я
I'm Anna
рассказываю вообще
Luchnik,
про архитектуру? Потому что за время своей карьеры
and I'm here
я, наверное,
making this
своими
report
собственными
because
руками
throughout my
нарисовала
career,
3-4 десятка архитектур.
I've
Пару
personally
десятков
designed
из
at
них я
least
реализовывала.
4
И кроме
dozen
того,
or 3
когда я
dozen
работала в
architectures, so many of them I've
консалтинговом подразделении
personally
Microsoft,
implemented.
я входила
And
в
back
команду
when I
Technical
worked for the
Quality Assurance.
consultancy division of
Поэтому
Microsoft, I
я
was part
еще
of the
смотрела и
technical
на чужие
quality assurance
архитектуры.
team, which means
И
that I
моей задачей
also
было
analyzed
сделать
other
так,
people's
чтобы на этапе
architectures
заключения договора на
with a view
выполнение каких-то работ
to
то, что заказчику было обещано в договоре, было
kind of
по
make
факту
sure
реализовано,
that whatever we
желательно с
promised
учетом
to our clients,
оговоренных сроков
we
и бюджетов,
delivered on
чтобы потом не было
within the
неприятных
time
или
and
судебных
budget
историй.
limits
Поэтому
agreed upon
насмотренность у меня
to make
довольно
sure
большая, и
all
я
the
буду
stakeholders
рассказывать
are
про
happy. So I've
то,
seen
как
quite a lot,
правильно строить
and I'm
архитектуру,
here to tell about
безопасную
how to
архитектуру.
develop your secure
Первое, о
architecture
чем
in
я
a
мечтаю,
smart
о том,
way.
чтобы у нас
Now, the
не
first
было
thing
в
I'm dreaming
будущем
of
IT-архитектуры
is
и
that in the
архитектуры ИБ.
future we
Чтобы
won't
единственное, что у нас
have
было, это сразу была
IT
безопасная
architecture which is
архитектура.
separate
Почему это
from
важно?
InfoSec
Потому что
architecture.
мы
I want
не
us to
можем
have
отдельно
a
построить
secure
архитектуру IT,
architecture, period.
отдельно
We
построить
cannot really
архитектуру ИБ
build
и потом все
IT
незаметно друг
architecture,
другу примотать.
then
Поэтому
InfoSec
это будет просто
architecture,
очень
and then try
некрасиво,
to
и
marry
главное,
them.
что от этого не станет безопасно. И можно
It won't
вспомнить
be
очень много
elegant,
примеров,
and this
особенно
combination will
сейчас
not
это
make
хорошо
either of
видно
them
на
more,
волне
more secure.
импортозамещения, когда многие компании бросаются делать
Many
быстро
companies
какие-то
now,
решения.
when
У
they
них есть
try to
задача
deploy something very
перекрыть
fast,
функционал, который был
they
у
will
зарубежных
often
вендоров, но
want
они вначале
to
думают о функциональной
provide
составляющей
similar
решения
functions
и
to
меньше
what
внимания
Western
обращают на то,
vendors
чтобы
provided,
сделать эту архитектуру
and they do
безопасной.
not really have the
Один
time
из
or the interest
примеров
in making this
мессенджеров, про
architecture
которые мы все
secure.
знаем,
Take
и
messengers, for
должен быть
example, or
обязательно
instant
корпоративный
messaging
мессенджер, чтобы
services.
сотрудники там могли переписываться.
Companies want to corporate
Если
messengers so
мы
that their employees can
посмотрим
exchange
на техническую
information.
составляющую, то, в принципе, здесь никаких
On the
проблем нет.
technical
С точки
side,
зрения
this is
безопасности,
no rocket science.
если на
In
начальном
terms
этапе
of
это не было продумано,
security,
то можно прийти к тому решению,
you know,
когда
if you
у
didn't
нас
think about security ahead of time,
корпоративный
you can
мессенджер, который
easily
находится
find
внутри
yourself in a
корпоративной сети,
situation where a
находится
corporate
вовне,
messenger
и у нас есть
inside
один и тот же
the corporate
порт,
network,
сервер и протокол, который
will
доступен
be
как
using
для
the same
подключения к
port,
конференции, так и для
server, and
администрирования.
protocol
И
that
такой
will be
возможности
used both
отдельно закрыть
for
интерфейс администрирования,
administration
сделать так, чтобы
and,
администратор
well,
подключался, например,
communication as
дополнительным
such.
фактором аутентификации, а не так же, как гость на конференции,
So you
просто-напросто
cannot
иметь лучшие
really,
возможности.
enable
Поэтому
the administrator to
важно,
connect
опять же,
using,
изначально
say,
на
a
этапе
different protocol
проектирования
or a different
заложить
set of
архитектуру, чтобы она
authentication
была
creds.
безопасной.
So it's certainly a
Что
good
для этого
idea
надо
to do
сделать?
it secure by
Первое, наверное,
design.
самое главное, это
Now,
сформулировать
the
задачи
first thing you
и
may want to
критерии выбора
do
нашей
is
архитектуры.
articulate your
Я еще раз
objective and
подчеркну,
your
что мы не
selection
можем отдельно
criteria.
выбирать айтишную
Let me stress
архитектуру
again that we
и
cannot
отдельно в соседнем
select
офисе
IT
или в другом
architecture
здании
separately from
выбирать архитектуру
InfoSec
безопасности. У нас
architecture.
сразу должна выбираться та айтишная
We gotta
архитектура,
choose
которая
the
сможет
right
реализовать те требования
IT
безопасности, которые у
architecture
нас
which
есть.
will meet
Иногда
all
мне кажется, что
security
я говорю
requirements that we
абсолютно очевидные
have.
вещи.
Sometimes I
Но
feel that what
я,
I'm
наверное,
saying
бы с
is
удовольствием не
totally
говорила их со
obvious.
сцены,
I
если бы
would
я регулярно
love
не сталкивалась
not
с
to
ними
say
на практике.
that.
Поэтому
However, what I see in
следующий
practice
момент,
tells me
после
I
того,
should
как мы
continue
определили,
doing
что
that.
нам надо, и определили критерии,
Now,
мы должны
after
найти
we've defined the
архитектуру, которая
criteria,
этим требованиям
we need
удовлетворяет.
to find the
И дальше
architecture that
очень
meets
важный
those
момент
criteria.
убедить в том, что
And
архитектуру надо
next, we need
принять.
to persuade
Причем с
others that
точки
they gotta
зрения
embrace this
того, чтобы
architecture.
убедить в правильности архитектуры, здесь
And
есть
persuading
две важные
could be
составляющие.
difficult. There are
Во-первых,
two
мы
important
сами
elements
для
here.
себя должны принять ту архитектуру,
One
которая
is that
соответствует
we
критериям.
need to embrace
Потому
this
что иногда очень
architecture on
хочется
our
сделать то,
own,
что мы
because,
привыкли делать,
sometimes
то,
we
что у нас
feel
и
like
так
doing
уже
what we are
реализовано,
used to
а не
doing
то,
because we already
что
have
новое
something,
и сложное. Потому что в
and
этой
the new
сети там
things
приятно.
sometimes feel
И с другой
complex
стороны, нам
and
необходимо эту
challenging.
архитектуру презентовать
People
тем
don't
людям,
like
у которых
challenges
есть бюджет,
usually.
которые
Next,
принимают
we need to
решения,
present
и
it
сделать
to
это
the
так,
decision
чтобы они,
makers
опять же,
or
выбрали
budget
ту архитектуру,
owners,
которая
and
правильная
also
и,
make sure that
возможно,
they
сложная и
select the right
дорогая, а не та,
architecture,
которая
which could
реализуется
be
быстро,
more
дешево,
complex
но потом
and more
приводит к
expensive
непредвиденным
rather
последствиям.
than the one that's
Опять же, мне
cheaper
очень
but
повезло
does not
с той презентацией,
result in
которая
the
была
right
передо
level
мной.
of
Я могу
security.
отсылать
I'm
те
very
примеры,
lucky
которые там были, да.
because
То
the
есть, опять же,
previous
если вы взяли
presentation
выбор
contained
плохой
lots of good
архитектуры,
examples. So
которая сломает
imagine that you
половину
chose a bad
автомобилей,
architecture
то,
and then you
наверное, не
need to
очень
recall like half
здорово
the cars you
по
produced.
такому пути идти.
That probably is
Еще раз
suboptimal.
подчеркну о том, что самое важное
Let
это
me stress again.
сформулировать задачу, и после этого
You
выбирать
start by
критерии
articulating where you want to get, and
Парадоксально, но
then
на самом
you
деле
gotta
формулировка
select your
задачи
assessment
на 90%
criteria.
определяет
The
наше
way
решение.
you
И разные
articulate your
задачи приводят
problem
к тому, что
drives your
удовольствие есть разные
solutions to
решения.
like 90%.
Можно начать, например, с довольно простого примера, с
Let me give you a simple example here related to securing your mail. There are numerous discussions about whether the mail server or service should be localized or it could be sitting in a cloud. There can be numerous and very protracted debates, but then people will completely forget that the emails themselves are sent kind of unencrypted, right? At least we cannot guarantee which servers they will go through, and the letters themselves are not properly protected. We don't really know how those letters will be routed. So, with the mail services, we probably want to have confidentiality, though, therefore, we should consider encrypting those letters. So we can use the traditional methods to encrypt the body of the letter, but not the header. The header will always be unencrypted. And that creates a conflict between what's recommended by those who believe in the fact that in the header, you should explain the key idea, the content. Like, for example, you are closing investment deal of for $2 billion. Now, the body of the letter will contain all the important details. But if you want to do some insider trading, maybe they don't really care about the small fonts. They can already start trading. So articulation and selection criteria play a very important role. What are the common mistakes when we go about selecting metrics? Now, arguably, the most common one is that we go for the metric which is easy to calculate. My favorite example, quote unquote, is assessing the quality of project documentation. How about we include the number of pages in specs and number of pages in the user manual? Isn't that a great metric? Easy to calculate. An architect can do that, a project manager, even a CFO can calculate it. What does it tell you about the quality of user manual? Nothing. What's also important is, say, the instructions for the users. Like, if they are 100 pages long, they're horrible. A good one is a one-pager. Particularly if it helps the admin address an existing problem. So the big question here is whether an administrator can quickly understand what it says and address, although ideally you will want to have a system which does not generate bugs at all. However, what we see very often is that people try to insert metrics which are easy to calculate. Next one is about measuring safety in percentage, like the percentage of users who have MFA or percentage of workstations running the latest version of your operating system. Now, what's wrong with this kind of metric? On the one hand, it might give us this impression that we are measuring safety. However, a perpetrator is not going to go after the systems which are secure. If you have just, a single account without a double dual-factor authentication and a weak password, well, in all probability, perpetrators will attack it. So, if you have less than 100%, you know what? Everything below 100% is like no better than 0%. If you have workstations which have not been updated, they will be attacked. So you don't want to measure it in percentage points. It's best to measure them in, logical terms, true or false. Another major issue is failing to take into account convenience for the users when we are considering security. Naturally, we will be considering our budget, and usually there will be this argument who will be maintaining it is the InfoSec or IT, and very often we forget about the users, which means that we as a company can easily have a secure messenger, a secure mail with a 2FA and VPN and a very secure 30-character password. But when users realize that they need to send a message, they just do it over Telegram because it's more convenient. Because, on Telegram, they can do it in, a single flick of the hand, and with a corporate mail, it will take them forever. So, this way, you will have secure systems that neither the users nor the perpetrators be interested in. This way, you're going to nudge your users towards systems you cannot control and systems that are not really secure. What else can happen? It can easily happen that the price of security is higher than the cost of the asset. I've, been there, done that. You can easily get carried away with the newfangled security solutions, and they have those sexy features. And eventually you realize that what you've budgeted for security is costlier than what you're trying to defend. Now, there's this well-known quote that if you're trying to defend both your diamonds and your pins with equal effort, eventually you'll run out of diamonds and you'll have only pins to protect. So prioritize, okay? Secondly, when we talk about budgets, very often we will budget for implementation and licensing and the first year of support. But total cost of ownership rarely looks at the human resources involved. Very often you will discover that in order to maintain the system, in order to, say, read the logs for the multi-factor authentication system, or in order to, say, reconnect the devices of your users and generate OTPs for them, you simply don't have the people. This is partially related to mistake number one. This way, the total security costs can exceed the price of mistakes, so to speak, the cost of assets. Another one is blurred responsibility boundaries. The best known example here is related to clouds. Now, cloud vendors love this infrastructure pictures, IS, BS, IS, where they show the distribution of responsibilities between the client and the cloud services provider. Paradoxically, when you procure a cloud service, you will be responsible, say, for encryption and storing encryption keys, but the service itself and the infrastructure are the responsibility of the provider. There have been numerous scandals lately when cloud services providers, CSPs, will take 6 months or 10 months to patch their vulnerabilities. Like, we have agreed on distribution of responsibilities. We can do nothing to force them to patch those vulnerabilities. And in all probability, we maybe don't even know there is a vulnerability there because, they've got there are some industry-wide standards for information disclosure. So vendors are not telling anybody about it, while, somebody may be using those 0 days. What else here? There is an important element related to operation, who's responsible for audits and configuration and further operation. You certainly want to agree on distribution of responsibilities from the outset. Now, if you see that an issue exists beyond your area of responsibility, what are the levers at your disposal? How can you make sure the problem gets addressed? Now that I've mentioned CSPs, I should also mention that after the sanctions got slapped on Russia, we have seen very clearly that, after force majeure conditions kick in, you should not expect anybody to, honor their contractual obligations. So it's very important for us to be able to reclaim effectively everything, and the system itself should be migratable, so to speak. So if your vendor, say, goes bankrupt, or for one or another reason they are no longer able to serve you, you gotta have a plan B, because after all, it's your responsibility. These are your systems you will want to operate. Which metrics to go for? In practice, I believe that at the top level, only one metric should be enough. Like annual cyber incident related damage should not exceed X. And it might sound like it's not enough, but you can then cascade it, and it will cover so many processes inside your company. Like, what do we consider an infosec incident-related damage? How you calculate it? What goes there? Like re-entering data, downtime, reputational damage, which is very difficult to quantify. What is actually considered an infosec incident? For example, if a catering lady accidentally poured a pail of dirty water over a server, is that an infosec incident or not? Or a courier steals the laptop of an employee. Is that physical security, information security, or what? So we need to clearly define what we consider an incident, how we calculate the damage, and there should also be a clear threshold, which will tell us whether we have been on the good side of our KPI or not. So bad metrics are the ones that result in mistakes I previously mentioned. So going for percentages is usually a stupid idea. Calculating the things that are easy to calculate, such as the number of incidents. As InfoSec professionals, we cannot really impact the number of incidents that can happen at the perimeter. That could be a metric for the attackers, but not for us as the blue team, so to speak. Now, what's the current issue with searching for and selecting a given architecture? Now, the problem is that the speed of change is on the rise, and the systems for which we are trying to select security solutions are also growing. Previously, security would be driven primarily by our desire to ensure the integrity of our documents. So we would produce, say, CAD files or Word files. So we were concerned that somebody could destroy these documents or change data in them. Currently, many systems are becoming cyber-physical systems, and they start escaping into the physical world. So the solutions that are being implemented in the industry, think digital transformation here, they mean the following, like imagine that previously you would have like a rusty valve, and the only threat that was there was that if you gave a bottle of vodka to the engineer that had to turn this rusty valve around, would incapacitate the guy. But no hacker could be a threat to a system. But now that you've installed automation, your systems get exposed to hackers, and complexity grows exponentially. A whole slew of new combinations of different tools become available, and we're still strapped in terms of time, money, and personnel to secure our perimeter and what's inside. Now, what that means is as follows. When we are looking for solutions, well, the easiest way to think about them is to stratify them into good decisions or good solutions and bad ones. Shown in blue are the good ones, and the good ones, they address the problem without creating new problems. While bad ones do not get us closer to the solution or to solving the problem and generate some bad side effects as well. Naturally, most solutions in this life have bad and good elements to them. So, for example, if we want to maximize communication speed, and we want our employees to quickly exchange information on like how many pizzas they ordered and where this pizza needs to be delivered, maybe we don't need three-factor authentication and VPN connections. Speed is what matters. Now, if we're talking about a higher caliber case where we are exchanging, say, some IP, maybe some technical drawings, maybe the speed of communications is not that important, but the security is. So for seemingly identical situations, exchange of information, the same solutions will be bad or good. I've already said that combinations of technologies and solutions is infinite. Well, we are constrained in terms of resources. So we'll always be looking at, say, 10 or 20 different solutions before we shortlist them. It is very important for us, as part of our selection method, to identify at least one good solution. It would be a shame to choose between 10 bad solutions, right? In our array or in a long list of solutions we're looking at, we got to have at least one good. How can we ensure that? Unfortunately, there is not a single reliable technical tool, but there are some relatively good practices we learned from designing complex systems. Now, that's what's called design thinking or spectral thinking. So the idea is that we should consider it from different perspectives, like which solution would be best for the user, which would be best for the administrator, which solution would be best for the clients, which means that we need to employ as many perspectives that make sense as possible. When we consider secure architecture in most cases, we will be repeating something that has already been done by somebody else. So if you consider how in a different country, in a different industry, or maybe at a different time, or maybe in a science fiction book, they addressed a similar problem, you may possibly find something that you will want to consider. Once you've identified your pool of potential solutions, you need to assess them, and you can certainly talk to experts. The problem with experts is that you rarely know how to pass a judgment on experts now. There are experts everywhere. Whichever social media you read, it's chock full of experts. And, whatever is hot in the news, everybody's an expert now on that. So how do you know if the expert is any good? Great if this expert has, experience implementing just the same solution elsewhere and your conditions are very similar, and you have recommendations from people you trust, that, this team of experts will stay the same. Now, if you're selecting a particular company, there will be specific people on the team who are instrumental in the previous projects being successful. If this person has left the company, there is no guarantee that this company will be good again. Alternatively, you can use the test environment. The test environment should not be dramatically different from your production environment. Now, in the test environment, some security functions will be off. Well, in all probability, when you put your system in production, everything will fall apart. Moreover, the test environment often becomes a production environment. For the recent Microsoft scandal, where they said that, they switched off multi-factor authentication on a test tenant, that's why the accounts of their top managers got hacked. Well, that's exactly the kind of case I'm talking about. This is a case of test environment becoming a production environment with nobody thinking about proper security measures being involved.
Спорное утверждение, которое может вызвать много споров. Это новое решение. Надо ли нам вообще новое решение?
Alternatively, you can say, do we really need a new solution? Maybe we can just re-rig what we have, such as using honeypots and traps. Do we need them? Do we need this deception system? We still have so many devices that will attract hackers. Do we need a DLP system if we still don't have data classification system? Like, we can obviously hope that we develop this classification as we do the DLP project, but that's naive. We should start by developing classification. Do we need a role-based access model? It's something I've seen a lot, particularly when we implemented IAM. So we talk to clients and they would tell us, we want role-based access model. These were some of my first projects. They said, sure, no problem, let's include it in the document, in the contract. And several months into it, we realized that there is just a single role, vanilla user who has mail access, and that's it. Everything else needs to be asked for. So with experience, I would tell them, let's first design the basic system, and afterwards, if you want, we will think about role-based access model. What's also important is that we should consider not just the system we are designing, but also the related systems. So even if we have ensured security on the inside, so to speak, our architecture should also provide for the possibility that our vendors and our suppliers will be attacked. We have all read the news about SolarWind and NotPetya, where supply chain attacks resulted in malware being brought into corporate perimeter. That's an old story, but I love it. Usually, security people think in lists, like we have a list of legal requirements, we have a list of systems to configure and maintain, we have a list of recommendations to follow. While the attackers think in graphs, they are thinking about, how they can get access to one node and then another one. So we can use different graphs to look for solutions. They could be attack graphs or knowledge graphs. So if you build an attack graph, putting yourself in the shoes of the attacker, well, this can get you pretty far in designing the right kind of system to defend against it. What we see as a centralized control tool, now that's a centralized propagation tool for the attacker. And our monitoring tool is a centralized tool for, say, observing the users, or maybe even managing those users. What's also important is that you make a decision which is selected in line with your criteria, and then you make sure it's the one that gets adopted by the company. When you describe a particular solution, you got to be very clear about the constraints and the scope of the project. Remember the mail example I previously gave. What is often forgotten is that, the headers do not get encrypted. This can easily be a surprise, a very nasty surprise for the top managers. When we describe a solution, ideally, we should strike the following balance. The scope of the project, very brief. A lot is said about what's outside the scope, and a lot is also covering the assumptions. The assumptions that should be very clearly defined. Like if we say we need to have two-factor authentication, well then we need to be crystal clear that all our employees have mobile phones and they will agree to install an application on those phones to generate the second factor. Next one is, how do you present this architecture? Now, depending on the level where you do your presentation, you will need different kind of arguments. If you do like an internal technical presentation, you will want to use like formal languages and the usual notation. But if you are presenting to the executives, the approach I like is the one used by Amazon. So they use like several pages where in human language they explain why we're proposing this decision or this solution, not something else. Now this way, you can minimize the time it takes to explain. And one of the good practices here, also used at Amazon, is that any meeting that should result in an important decision to be made starts with everybody reading this text. Like Jeff Bezos said, very often when executives come to a meeting, they behave like students at an exam. You ask them if they've read the document, they say, yes, we have. Well, they haven't. So it's a good idea to start the meeting with everybody reading the documents. What's also important is that safe architecture, secure architecture cannot be static, which means you got to monitor not just the technical solutions, but also the sanctions and the M&As. Think about Curator, the CM system from IBM, which got bought from them. It will obviously have an impact on your architecture, won't it? Given what the owners are now planning to do about it. Now, if you want more details, please snap the QR code in my Telegram channel. I talk much more in detail about making decisions.